Hello again. Part 2. Title's going to be Monsters and Myth, or Monsters and Mythology. And I don't have enough time to go through every monster and discuss their mythology, but a question was raised in the comments section of the last video that why I was talking about vampires and zombies and classical monsters quite so much, and the reason is because they're road signs, they're markers. I can say vampire, and you have an absolute image in your mind of what vampire means that I can then toy with for my story. But all I had to do is say vampire, and you can assume they're undead, they're bloodsuckers, they may be afraid of crosses, they may be hurt by sunlight, things like that. They progenate through devouring a person and that person dying and being reborn as a vampire. You have the idea of the mythology. Werewolf spreads through a claw or a bite. It's probably a curse, possibly genetic. It's all of these things. You turn into a wolf, you turn into a wolf man, maybe, more than likely, and the full moon has something to do with it. And then I can strip those out, I can add my own silver bullets, yes, no. It's really easy, kind of lazy, but it's very easy to get. It's a hell of a lot easier to get someone on board with, it's a vampire, a publisher or a friend on board with, I have a vampire story, than I have a story about something you don't know anything about, and it's going to explain it to you. That said, the person did hit the nail on the head when he said that horror is more about the unknown. It's about, like Lovecraft said, and I'm going to reference Lovecraft a lot. I'm a huge fan, so, you know, the oldest emotion, human emotion, is fear, and the oldest thing, human fear, is the fear of the unknown. I'm paraphrasing, but I think I'm close. The idea that what you don't know is what's going to terrify you much more. But to get that point, you have to get the reader on board, and that's where we get into mythology. I'm not talking about Zeus and Odin. I'm not talking about Horus and Yahweh. I'm not talking about mythology and the external mythology from our world. I'm not talking about your mythology and my mythology. I'm talking about the internal mythology of the setting. As anyone who wants to create a story or create anything that's going to get people involved, it's the most important skill you can cultivate. And it's the reason, at least for me, a lot of stories end up losing me fast. If you establish that whosoever draws the sword from the stone shall be the King of England, and at some point in the story you decide to have Bob do it because Bob's a good guy, and Bob does it, and then he's not the King of England, well, you need to goddamn explain why he's not the King of England now. Whatever you change from whatever you have set up in the mythology needs to be lampshaded in the story. If I create a story where there is no magic, and all of a sudden I introduce a magic user, that magic user then has to be explained. Seems like it would make sense, but a lot of times, especially when stories have a lot of continuity or very little continuity, it gets forgotten. It does. It's just a basic fact of creativity, is that every once in a while you'll forget that, you know, unicorns can't fly, and all of a sudden you got a flying fucking unicorn, and it's like, well, how do I explain that? Because now that you've written it, now that it's out there, someone's like, but you said. Now, if you earn good faith with your audience, they might trust you, but you have to earn that faith, and how you earn that faith is by maintaining your mythology up to this point. You know, the story makes sense. But why is it important? Well, it establishes the fourth wall. It's what the internal mythology is, what gets the reader, gets the audience to latch onto your story and stay with you and follow you. They are putting their trust in you that this story is going to make sense. And that's all well and good. Fantasy story, fine. Sci-fi, fine. But horror, it's so important to have your audience's trust in horror because they have to be there with you. You're not just trying to tell them a story they're going to find fun. You're trying to tell them a story that ultimately isn't fun and will still affect them. The best horror stories affect you. Maybe not the rest of your life. You're not going to look over your shoulder the rest of your life for the fucking cult that was mentioned in fucking subsection B of, dissertations on a dipshit. But it's going to stay with you, and it stays with you because it had an effect. You want to elicit emotional response in the reader, and to do that, the reader has to be in the story. They have to accept the rules of your world. It's why modern day Earth, for whatever that means for you, works best for horror, because the reader can read it and associate himself with the character or herself. I don't want to be whatever, but the reader can associate themselves with the character. It's important, and I know I just said that, but if they can't, you've basically written a shitty ghost story. It's one of the things Lovecraft did very well, and again, I'm going to bang on that drum a couple more times. These videos, more than likely, I'm a Lovecraft fan. He's what got me really into horror. I was always a fan of like scary stories and stuff like that. Lovecraft's what got me into like, oh crap, this can actually scare me. This can actually do something. And how he did it, by and large, was first-person stories. Because if you read I am this and I'm doing this or I did this long enough, you start to associate yourself with the character. And he generally presented his characters as smarter than the audience. And so when that person was confused, when that person brought up things that you didn't understand, you trusted them because you've trusted them up to this point. They're a fucking anthropology professor, or they're leading a fucking archaeological dig in Australia, or they're, flying to Antarctica to fucking uncover an ancient city. And even when they aren't smart guys, they're talking about like local customs and local streets, places you've never been, so you trust them on their directions, you trust them where they're going, because they're the ones who have to guide you, and they're talking as if it's almost like it's a conversation. Now his word choices aren't great, and a lot of it is very verbose in that highfalutin kind of talk, because he's using words that are antiquated, and he's using words that are out of date and bigger than people generally use, because he was writing for an elite race of people who stood above the workers, and he of course was one of those people. Again, it was a common belief in that time, so he just had some issues. But if you can get through that, it's almost like the character's telling you the story, and so you can identify a lot easier with it. And when they get to things that sound confusing or seem confusing, it's because the character's confused, and you can accept that. Sherry Priest, not really horror. Her stories are more, what the fucking was the term? Urban adventure, shit like that. Urban fiction, urban fantasy. No, urban fantasy. That's what it was. Urban fantasy. That's what they're calling the genre of basically supernatural modern day, but not really scary. She has several series of books, but they're all written in relatively the same way, and they're written in the first person, and her style is very much we're sitting down having a conversation, and I'm telling you what happened. You don't get any input. We're not going to take a break so we can, I can go back and explain who the fuck that guy was, or what the fuck that thing was. So it's not really a conversation, but it does feel like you're reading like a journal, or you're reading something along those lines. You're reading someone's thoughts. And so it's a lot easier to get immersion that way, but again, you still have to maintain that mythology, that idea of this universe makes sense to these people. And when it doesn't make sense to these people, when those rules break, that's when the author has to step in and make sure that that break is justified. Now, in little doses and little things like that, it could be unexplained, but the characters have to notify the characters are your vehicle. They're the insert of your audience, and you have to explain through those characters why these rules can be broken now. And if they don't know, they at least have to acknowledge that this is wrong. You know, if all of a sudden water starts dripping up in a fantasy story, we don't know if that's weird. You know, if you're writing a story, a horror story set in a fucking magical fantasy world, then when someone walks up and they've got horns, you can't just assume the person thinks that that's a demon. That might just be another race. It might just be a magical person. It could be a magical curse. And fuck, maybe these people don't care about demons. That's why fantasy is really hard to maintain in mythology, and it's why fantasy authors have a lot of my respect, because Jesus. But fantasy's being done. No one's really doing horror. I mean, the big like four are Kuntz, King, Barker, and I'm sure there's someone else. I think Lumley's still around doing horror. The only one of those I could get into is Barker, because he has a very good visceral, in his short stories especially, he has a very visceral feel that draws you in easily, and he tends to maintain his goddamn mythologies. And his stories tend to deal with the unknown. But yeah, that's the basic gist of all of this, is that if you're going to create an internal, a world or a universe for your stories, you need to have a consistent mythology, and that's coming back to the original part of this conversation with myself while you watch, I guess. That's why the monsters, the classic monsters, are so easy to use. If I say vampire, again, you're going to have an idea of a vampire, and all I have to do is lampshade the things that are different. And that's why a lot of writers, especially in the last 20 or so years, have really started to bang on those classic monsters and try to change them into other forms to make them fit other genres, because they're still, ooh, dangerous, but now you can put them in a romance, and now you can put them in a whatever the fuck you're going to do next. But that's all just lampshading what's different. You're still using those linchpins and those road signs to help the reader understand what you're talking about. But you got to work out what you're doing. And you don't have to figure out the entire universe when you start your story, but the stuff you establish as you go, you have to maintain. You're going to lose fans. If you end up building a following, you're going to lose them if you're creating a series and all of a sudden the series just doesn't make any goddamn sense, or this character choice just doesn't make any goddamn sense. If you establish that whoever puts on this magic ring becomes can with the choice of a word become the Green Knight, and then someone later put the Green Knight's freed from his curse and he can wander the world, but someone puts on the ring and becomes the Green Knight. It doesn't make any goddamn sense, because now you've got two Green Knights and you're not explaining that to anybody. You're just kind of going, well, yeah, shut the fuck up. But yeah, that's the basic idea. As I said, if you're gonna be offended by me going but yeah or swear, probably watch something else. But it's important that you keep your readers' trusts, and how you do that is you keep the characters in the story true to what you've established at the beginning, and you be honest with them when things change. Again, you don't have to tell them everything. Telling them everything is actually counterproductive in horror, but they have to understand that the characters realize that it's different. And if the characters don't, then the player, I'm also a role player, then the reader needs to understand that. That's true of movies, video games, books, comic books, fucking oral stories. The audience has to be willing to come along the ride, and it's much more important that they do so in a horror story, because, like I said, you live or die by their trust. You live or die by their willingness to come with you, and if you lose them early, you're not going to get them back. So, those of you out there who are, like me, aspiring horror writers, just keep your mythology in mind. If you're doing it, for people who are working with other people to create mythologies over multiple stories, make sure you're kind of keeping the same idea bandied about when it comes to things, and you're notifying each other when things change. But otherwise, yeah, uh, video went longer than I expected, and so I'm now just rambling. So have a good night and enjoy.